and a pleasure to open our international conference on From Polarization to Civil War, History, Politics, and Law. And the idea to hold this conference germinated when Professor Mark Graeber from Maryland University accepted my invitation to visit at the Harry Razener School of Law. Professor Graeber is one of the most interesting and prolific writers in the fields of constitutional law and comparative constitutional law, and he is someone to run ideas by. You can always get his honest and challenging opinion. And he happens to be a unique expert in the field of civil war. He actually has been working for over a decade on a series of books on the Civil War. His book titled Punish Treason and Reward Loyalty, The Forgotten 14th Amendment, is forthcoming these days. Less did I know that the topic would be of special relevance in the Israeli current political climate. We are witnessing these days the formation of a hardcore right-wing coalition that tosses almost on a daily basis new ideas that might threaten the very independence of institutions that support the rule of law in Israel, including an attack on the independence of the police, the army, the courts, the attorney general, the civil service, you name it. And these are challenging times for Israel, and some of the topics that we are going to discuss today are definitely relevant to the current political climate in Israel. We are going to discuss issues such as the relationship between the media and politicians. And as we know, this is part of the Netanyahu trials these days. We are going to discuss topics such as the populist attack on the courts and separation of powers, disqualification from serving in office that is relevant, as we know, and is currently discussed with regard to the minister or the about to become minister, Aryeh Deri. We are going to discuss civil disobedience and other topics that are of special relevance in the Israeli current situation. I'm very hopeful that the issues we discuss remain in the academic level, and that many of the threats that we are witnessing these days against the institutions that support the rule of law in Israel are going to remain attacks on the Twitter and on the social media, other outlets of the social media, but are not going to materialize. So let's hope the future is better than it currently looks. So we are expecting an interdisciplinary discussion with experts in the fields of law, history, political science, and philosophy. Let's have the fun begin. And I want to call on my colleague and friend, Dr. Adam Shenar, to lead the first session. I want to suggest that as we go about the first session, each of the speakers will come and speak at his or her turn, and otherwise you can stay in the audience. For the Q&A, you can all meet at the table. So just a word or two on my colleague, Dr. Adam Shenar. First of all, he's a friend, he's a colleague. He sits right next to me. I'm in love with his children. But beyond that, he's an amazing scholar. He focuses on constitutional law. He's writing currently on the topic of censorship, and I'm expecting it to be a fascinating research and hopefully a book. So much more to say, but without further ado, Dr. Adam Shenar, the floor is yours.
Great. So thank you, Aviv, for inviting me to chair this first session. We have three wonderful speakers, and I'll be very, very quick because the bios are available, but I'll introduce them in advance instead of just coming up every time someone finishes. So our first speaker is Professor Hanna Lerner. She's the head of the School of Political Science in Tel Aviv University. And among her many works and areas of expertise. She's currently focusing on, has been focusing for a long time on constitution making and constitution making in divided societies, and also her current project is also about constitutional advice, if I'm not mistaken, about how entities other than the country that is adopting the constitution affects or tries to influence the adoption of the constitution. And Hani will speak about failed constitution making processes and the role of external advisors. And afterwards, we will hear from Doreen. Doreen's here? Oh, okay, didn't see you. Okay. From Dr. Doreen Lustig from the Faculty of Law in Tel Aviv University, who will discuss her paper, Monopolizing War, Codifying the Laws of War to Reassert Governmental Authority from 1856 to 1874. And Doreen is a professor in Tel Aviv University, and her focus is on international law and global governance, and also constitutional law, and recently also climate change. And her latest book talks about the history of international law and the relationship of international law and the private corporation from the late 19th century to the late 20th century. And finally, you will hear from Mr. Bini Ashkenazi, who's a lawyer, but he's also has two hats. One of the hats that he is he's a doctoral student at Reichman University under the supervision of Professor Weil. And he's also the legal correspondent for Walla News, and he's writing his dissertation on the relationship between politicians and the media, and he's going to present accordingly from that dissertation, I suspect, when should the relationship between politicians and media be criminal. So we have 3 speakers for this panel, and we have 90 minutes, which means if we want to allow time for discussion, I suggest each speaker speaks up to 20 minutes, and then which will allow us half an hour, and I'll be fastidious about timekeeping, also because I have to leave at 1:30 to teach. So that's it. So without further ado, our first speaker, Professor Lerner, Hani.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present here today and to participate in this really very interesting and timely conference. And congratulations, Mark, on the new forthcoming book, which I admit I haven't read the whole book, but I did read the materials that you sent. In the new book, Mark Graeber makes some very important and interesting claims concerning the way the drafters of the 14th Amendment viewed the role of Constitution in mitigating internal conflicts and preventing future civil wars. So according to his account, and I'm quoting, congressional reconstruction regarded constitutional reform as central to their effort to prevent rebel rule. The presumption underlying this claim is that constitutions actually matter and may indeed mitigate political conflicts and prevent violence. Such presumption may seem to be sort of stating the obvious to maybe the audience in this room, but it's far from being a non-controversial statement. For many skeptic political scientists, especially in Israel, a country with a history of more than 70 years of more or less functioning democracy with no formal complete written constitution. So I think Mark's book is a very important reminder concerning the ways in which constitutions may be used as a political tool for addressing internal tensions, disagreements, and potentially explosive conflicts. In this sense, the story of the American 14th, and I mean this set of the post-Civil War amendments seems to be a classic case of post-conflict constitution making or post-conflict constitutional amendment, a topic which received quite extensive scholarly attention in the field of comparative constitution making in recent years. At the same time, it is also important to emphasize that the attempt to resolve the post-conflict polarization in the US through constitutional means was done entirely by local actors. And this is in clear contrast to most cases of contemporary post-conflict constitution making, which relies to varying degrees on external players. including foreign governments, international organizations, constitutional advisors, etc. The American Constitution is often presented as the first modern constitution, so in my short presentation, I'd like to put Mark's project in this kind of more comparative and modern perspective and consider it alongside contemporary cases of post-conflict constitution making and suggest some thoughts concerning the relationship between constitutions and conflict, especially focusing on the role of external players. So in a recent project, as Adam already mentioned, I began to map this universe of international constitutional advisors. The idea of external constitutional advising is not new. Rousseau, as you all know, is often considered the first constitutional advisor to Corsica. And we're familiar, of course, with Ivor Jennings, the British lawyer who advised and was involved in nearly 24 constitution-making projects in Asia and Africa. Carl Friedrich, and there are many famous names that were involved in advising foreign constitutions throughout history. But in recent years, the field has become increasingly more institutional, more professional. We see increasing number of organizations involved in external advising to a process of constitution drafting and amendment. Since around 2006, more or less, we can see many jobs have been created for officers of constitution building and constitution making in large and small organizations, in the UNDP, other parts of the UN, international IDEA, etc. So I'll first present some of our kind of initial findings in this project, just to kind of give an overall framework and of the scope of the field, and then I'll say a few words about impact. So how does this work?
Is the presentation already there?
Yeah, it's supposed to be here. Oh, here. Okay.
No.
This thing? It's here?
Okay, what did you?
Okay. Okay, here we go. Okay, so in this project we created two data sets. The first includes all of the organizations that were involved to some degree in international constitutional advising since 1989, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, until 2017, which was the year that we started this project. So here we list 45 organizations. The scope of their involvement varies. I mean, not all of them devote the same amount of energy, time, budget, people to work on constitutional advising, but they all do have some component of that kind of activity within the organization. As you can see, so most of the headquarters are located, not surprisingly, in Western countries, mostly in the US, Switzerland, and Germany. We focused on organizations that operate within the English-speaking world. There are other sort of advising activities that are done in Francophone Africa and in Latin America, but these are mostly not organized by institutions, but individual advisors operate there. So the majority, this field is by large an English-speaking kind of universe. We then clustered, so these organizations can be clustered into 4 types. Governmental organizations, such as USAID, intergovernmental organizations, such as UNDP or International IDEA, or the Forum of Federations, non-governmental organizations, such as International Law and Policy Group, or Democracy, some DRI, if you are familiar with this organization. And we have academic and research centers that some of you, you're familiar with many of them. Excuse me. We also wanted to know which type of organization is most active. So I should mention that we created a second data set that included almost 689 episodes of advising in 144 countries. And by advising episode, we mean a particular organization operating in a particular country at a particular time. As you can see here, the intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations sort of dominate the field. Although in the case of, I should mention that in the case of intergovernmental, the IGO, you see they are sort of in charge of nearly 2/3 of the advising activities around the world, but about half of them are done by one organization, which is the Venice Commission. And as you can see, there are a lot of academic centers, but they're kind of involved in less than 6% of the different advising cases that we've managed to track. However, analyzing the influence of advising organizations requires, a greater complexity than just simply aggregating the case numbers, because not all organizations tend to perform the same kind of advising activities. So what do these organizations do? When claiming to provide institutional advising, the different organizations do or operate in different means. So the range of practices that may appear under sort of constitutional advising is very, very broad, as you can see from this scale. What we try to do here is we've created a 9-point scale ranging from activities that entail the least direct intervention, which is 1. So, for example, if one organization just finds a different organization, they're not super involved. And the other end of the spectrum, are activities that are directly involved in the drafting process, that is preparing drafts or even complete constitutions. And in between, there are many sort of varieties of different kinds of reports that these organizations produce, whether they're about past events, current projects, or current problems. Only technical assistance, number 7, is the activity that requires sort of foot on the ground. So that's the only that type of activity involves direct sort of contact between the external consultant or external advisor and the actors, the local actors who are in charge of drafting the Constitution. So remember this number 7, because our next slide to combine this data, and as this sort of slide demonstrates, most organizations tend to perform activities that do not require ongoing sort of field work. This is not surprising, as you can see. So number 6 is is just organizing workshops, and number 7 here, only 24 organizations, which is about less than half of the organizations that we study actually engage in what they broadly term technical assistance, which means different things, but we've defined this term as a kind of a direct involvement on the ground in the field of external advisors in the local national process of drafting. I actually have no idea how much time I have left, and where am I on the... Should I rush or should I take it easy?
You have 8 minutes.
Okay, so yeah, it's enough time. Okay. So where do these organizations operate? Right. This is actually, here we're getting to the more interesting, I think, questions. Well, in most countries, only between 1 or so. We found that these 45 organizations actually were active in over 140 countries, so most countries in the world. in most of these countries, only between 1 to 3 external organizations have been sort of active or did some kind of advising project. But in some cases, there were 10 different organizations that were involved in constitutional advising. And many of them operate simultaneously, right, on the same kind of constitution writing project. And this is the list of, I don't know, is it too small? Can you see it? I mean, the list of the countries where the greatest number of advising organizations were involved. So at the top of the list, we can see Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya with 16 organizations, Tunisia, Kenya and Nepal with 13 different ones, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Bolivia. I mean, these are kind of the usual suspects of countries that that get this kind of external advising, and all of them are conflicted societies, right? They're all countries torn by some version of a civil war or an ongoing internal conflict, which brings us back to the question of, again, constitution making and conflict. So interestingly, while only a few countries attracted multiple advising organizations, we were surprised, or another finding that we have, we were surprised by the number of countries in which external advisors were actually directly involved in the drafting process. So this is just to sort of give you a broader context. In the top right figure, you can see the distribution of countries by highest activity conducted within them, which means basically that about 40 countries in our 40% of the countries in our data set had external agent that performed technical assistance, which is, again, very kind of direct involvement, at least once in the last 3 decades. And the top, okay, we're not, the top, the bottom figure suggests that most countries do, it shows sort of the distribution of advising involvement in the different countries. So as you can see, a lot of countries received only 1 or 2 advising activities. And here we can see exactly these numbers, but on a map. So you see that Africa is the continent where most direct activities have been conducted. In the majority of African countries, external organizations provided more direct sort of kind of advising or involvement or intervention. And in contrast, Eastern European, less sort of more kind of the mid-range, reporting and workshop, that kind of advising intervention. So compare, and here this map shows the distribution of again, the different activities that were conducted in the different countries around the world. So comparing these two maps and the graphs raises the question concerning the potential correlation between the number of external organizations involved in particular drafting projects and the intervention degree, right, of directness. We thought that we'll find a positive correlation between the countries of the highest scores and on the direct activity scale and the highest number of organizations, but we actually could not find any kind of correlation in that regard. And that also goes with the question of impact. We try to see whether we can detect some kind of impact of external advising on the measures of democracy or other kinds of measures, and we couldn't find any kind of direct correlation between any kind of external activity, any kind of external involvement or a success. So I'm not going to go through all the details of the empirical findings, and maybe I'll I'll jump to the conclusion, which basically, so to conclude, I'd like to make two sort of comments or observations. So at this stage, we know very little about how external experts may indeed advance peace, democracy, or social goods through constitution making. And obviously, further research is much needed, and this is actually the objective or the goal of the next phase of our research. So, for example, it's not entirely clear whether large or strong organizations such as the UN or the European Council, which sort of hold political leverage over governments in developing or democratizing countries, may have greater access compared with small NGOs. So from interviews that we've conducted and other parts of the data that I didn't present, we showed that an alternative hypothesis actually might work, namely that the political leverage stemming from extra-organizational sort of geopolitical conditions may weaken rather than strengthen external organizations' influence on constitutional drafting. And intense pro-democratic and pro-liberal efforts by Western-based organizations may actually create resentment by domestic actors in post-conflict and democratizing states. Egypt is a good example, and there are other examples for this kind of resistance that was made by local actors, and then actually smaller organizations and that are perceived as less threatening might have greater impact. So NGOs, for example. And maybe a last final remark concerning sort of this connection between external players, constitution, and conflict. Actually, on the day that the Queen of Britain passed away, yeah, I was in Edinburgh. I participated in a workshop on failed constitution making, which brought together really scholars and practitioners from all over the world. Now, the main cases that were discussed in this workshop was exactly this list of cases, to the usual suspects. And these are all cases of failed processes of constitution making, which really brings me to sort of raises the question of maybe managing expectations. So I'm worried that some constitutional drafters expect too much of the process. And in some cases that were framed as failed processes of constitution making, they are actually, the expectations were just, they had too many expectations, and by managing expectation, what I basically mean is that we need to make some distinctions. So first, a distinction between peacemaking and constitution making. And this is a distinction that is often discussed, and there are different sort of, these processes operate on different sets of goals and timeframes, short-term versus long-term. The second distinction is between constitution making and state building. I'm not sure that state building can be achieved through negotiations, negotiated process of constitution making. Constitutions are primarily written in order to allocate power between political institutions and set limitations on political power. And this can work when state institutions function well. In many of these cases, state institutions are not functioning, and hence trying to write the constitution is not going to work. And the last distinction is between constitution making and social reform. Here again, it was Hanna Lerner who said, who sort of explained the difference between the French and American success by suggesting that the French tried to achieve too much in their constitution and create a social reform. And we can see these examples in Nepal, recently in Chile. Overburdening the process of constitution making is, again, a problem with managing expectations. So that's it. I'll again thank you, Mark, for reminding us that actually a successful process of post-conflict constitution making depends very much on internal powers and not external actors. And thanks again. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is